All right, welcome everybody. So this event that you're attending tonight is one of the culminating events of the Future of Work and Income Research Network, which has been a chance over the last 3 years for Alex, Douglas, and I to explore all sorts of interesting philosophical issues concerning, well, the future of work and income. And we're really happy to be putting on a public event that hopefully will, move forward in what we think is an important discussion. Let me introduce our panelists today, starting from closest to me and moving ahead. So we have William Thomson, who is co-host of the Scotonomics YouTube show and author of A Just Transition, an Unlikely Destination for the Scottish Economy. Next to him is Virginia Mantouvalou, a professor of human rights and labor law at University College London, author of the 2023 book Structural Injustice and Workers' Rights, and co-editor of the 2015 book The Right to Work, Legal and Philosophical Perspectives. Then we have Philippe van Parijs. He is the Hoover Chair of Economic and Social Ethics at Université Catholique de Louvain. I'm probably butchering that. And co-author of the 2017 book Basic Income, A Radical Proposal for a Free Society and a Sane Economy. And finally, Andrea Veltman is a professor of philosophy at James Madison University, author of the 2016 book Meaningful Work, and co-editor of the 2014 book Autonomy, Oppression, and Gender. Marion Ellison is probably on her way. We were expecting her here. I'll introduce her if and when she arrives. Daniel Johnson, who was the other panelist, had to cancel at the last minute because he's an MSP, and as happens sometimes with MSPs, meetings get called at the last minute, and he felt that the one that got called for tonight he couldn't skip. So unfortunately, he won't be with us. So the format for tonight is after I'm done speaking here, Alex Douglas is going to talk a little bit about a job guarantee, what that's all about. And then each panelist will get 5 minutes to give their perspective on the topic of a job guarantee for Scotland. Alex and I will then come in with questions, one question for each panelist, and then they'll have a chance to respond, and other panelists can interject if they wish. And then we'll finish off with some audience Q&A. There will be several ways to ask questions. Obviously, you've seen the enormous QR code on the screen, so you can type in your questions on this app called Vvox, which Alex and I will be monitoring. So we'll read out questions that way. We'll have some questions submitted by our online audience, which I'll be able to see on this screen. Yep. And then I think 4 ways, come to think of it. If you want to write down a question, I've got blank paper and plenty of pens, and just wave to me and you can submit a written question, or you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you. So that is the format for tonight. Again, so I'm Ben Sachs-Cobb. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy. Alex Douglas is also senior lecturer in the Department of Philosophy here at St. Andrews, and I'm going to hand it over to him to talk about the idea of a job guarantee.
Great. Well, thanks very much to Ben and to our panel of speakers. Also, thanks to the Arts and Humanities Research Council for providing funding for this, as Ben mentioned, and the Scotland's Future series, which is an ongoing series. There's a website you can check out some of the other events. So this event is about the appropriateness of a job guarantee for Scotland. Now, some of our speakers are international speakers who may have knowledge of context other than the Scottish context. Others are experts on Scottish policy, but so we're going to kind of zoom in and out as necessary from thinking about the idea of employment guarantees in general, philosophically, and thinking about issues to do with Scotland specifically. But a job guarantee, I mean, people use this term to mean lots of different things. Politicians are especially notorious for using words to mean often the opposite of what they should mean. What we mean tonight is a state-sponsored program to provide employment to all willing recipients of the guarantee. Where no suitable vacancies can be found for somebody in the public or private sector, and of course suitable is open to interpretation, the state undertakes to finance and facilitate the direct creation of a suitable role. There are differing views on who would be eligible for a job guarantee, but generally advocates of this policy propose to extend the guarantee to any citizen or any qualifying resident who is willing and able to work. The conditions of a job guarantee are that roles should be tailored to the skills, the location, and the availability of members. So it doesn't count as a job guarantee if you're offered a job 200 miles away, or if you have a disability that isn't catered for at all in the role. Part-time roles should be offered to people with caring responsibilities. Suitable adjustments should be made for disabilities. The job guarantee should also abide by minimum wage legislation, laws to protect the rights of workers as they exist. You might wonder who's supposed to pay for this scheme. So the idea generally is that the costs of creating jobs are borne by the national government, and the full job guarantee scheme is just recorded as an item on the national budget. If you look on the HM Treasury whole of government accounts, you can see how government programs are accounted for there. It would just be added to that list. There are macroeconomic issues around this, which we may get into, but for now, I'll just say that much. A job guarantee we're understanding to be something that, although centrally funded, doesn't need to be centrally planned. So the national government can award grants to local governments, to community organisations, to charities, etc., to create roles as needed. The point is that it's financing the creation of a suitable role somewhere in the third sector, public sector, or possibly in some cases in the private sector, as, in accordance with the other restrictions on the scheme. Some people confuse job guarantee with workfare. These are very different policies. Workfare is generally understood to mean a system for financially pressuring people to work by making welfare benefits conditional on employment, whereas the job guarantee scheme is compatible with unconditional out-of-work benefits or with universal basic income or other ways of paying people who aren't in work. The purpose is to offer employment to people who want it. It's not to use a work condition to force people to take employment. The big question, how much would it cost? This is debatable. Advocates argue that the cost of the scheme has to be weighted against the benefits of avoiding some of the costs of unemployment. So that's something to bear in mind. We spend a lot of money in various ways on having lots of people involuntarily unemployed. So you have to subtract that from whatever the scheme would cost. But just some numbers. The Trades Union Congress in the UK estimated in 2020 that UK unemployment, including what are called the scarring effects of youth unemployment, were costing the Treasurer, the Exchequer, around £28 billion. So that would be a lot to subtract from whatever the scheme would cost. A study of a pilot job guarantee scheme in Austria found the cost per person to be less than that of unemployment itself. So possibly, in the best case scenario, the job guarantee scheme would be revenue positive, or at least not very costly at all. But of course, this is something that our panelists might want to debate. The sorts of work that people might do, this is again something to be left up to the local groups that are administering the program. So they would be tasked with finding suitable, fulfilling, ideally useful tasks for members. But it's worth remembering the main goal is to provide members with dignity and the experience of having a job. It's not to generate profit. It's not to provide essential services either. Because this is a guarantee scheme that people can enter and leave as they like, you wouldn't want to make public services dependent on employment in this scheme. So public services, essential public services, is a separate thing. This is for the benefit of the person being employed first and foremost. On the other hand, advocates say that successful members of this scheme might use the skills and training and experience and discipline that they gain on the scheme to then go and find more suitable roles in the private sector or in the official public sector. Has this been tried before? Arguably, yes, although people again debate about whether different historical instances actually count as a job guarantee scheme. But one of the largest things like this is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act of 2005 in India. There was also the Plan Jefes Ejegas de Jugar Desocupados in Argentina. These were both somewhat successful on various measures when they were run. They were shut down for reasons external to the success of the programs themselves, issues of corruption, other political changes. In the UK, the 2009 Future Jobs Fund had some elements of a job guarantee and may have developed in that direction, but it was shut down the following year when the government changed in the 2010 election. So I hope that gives us enough of a common starting point to talk about, and I will now hand over to the panelists. We'll just go maybe down the line, starting from Andrea. If you can just outline your own initial views on this policy. And,
sure, should I come up and
think
speak
about it.
over there?
It's,
Yes, please.
yeah,
Okay,
please.
sure. All right. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for having me here. Happy to partake in this discussion of an interesting proposal. I come at this primarily as a philosopher of work and as someone who has argued that meaningful work is integral in human flourishing. I spent some time in my book, Meaningful Work, talking a bit about the harms of unemployment, both personally and socially. So I would say at the start that one of the strong features of this proposal or this scheme is that it's motivated by an important truth that jobs are essential in the flourishing of individuals and communities. For individuals, jobs are not only a means to a paycheck, but also a way of exercising skills, earning esteem, and serving a purpose in the world. Work is a source of pride, peer recognition, and self-respect. Work provides a satisfying outlet for our energies, a way of structuring our days, a way of being useful, and a sense of accomplishment that comes from a job well done. Furthermore, a wealth of empirical literature has shown that unemployment is harmful psychologically. Mental breakdowns and even suicides can follow unemployment, which fosters feelings of discouragement, isolation, and hopelessness. Unemployment damages not only the mental health of the unemployed, but also family relationships and broader communities. A loss of work has been associated with a notable decline in the quality of neighborhoods, a decline in the quality of family relationships, and an increase in crime. And so that is certainly one solid point in favor of this proposal. Unemployment, again, is harmful not only for individuals psychologically, but also harmful for communities and neighborhoods. But on the other hand, I do think that there are a number of reasons to be skeptical of the proposal. And let me just mention a few of those reasons. First of all, some theorists of economics will explain to us that unemployment is a structural feature of any freely functioning labor market economy. I think that this proposal would be strengthened if it had a sort of empirical economic foundation, if there were economic theorists who were willing to say that approaching 0% unemployment was even reasonable as a goal or something to that effect. So the fact that it has an ethical foundation is not really sufficient for the proposal. It also has to be feasibly, empirically, and from a sort of economic theoretical point of view. Also, one might say in skepticism of this proposal that the state is ill-equipped to serve as an employer of last resort. The bureaucracy of the state seems to suit it more to distributing basic goods such as money, or to enforcing labor laws such as those aimed at securing the health and safety of employees, but not to arranging for not to arranging for individuals to find good work, which is a highly individualized pursuit. Relatedly, even though work is surely a good thing, not all good things can be provided as a matter of right or as a matter of guarantee or entitlement. Now, friendship, for instance, is surely a good thing in life, but no one has a right to friendship, just as no one has a right to happiness. Finding meaningful work in particular involves seeking and establishing a mutually beneficial relationship between employee and employer, which is not fundamentally unlike seeking and establishing a mutually beneficial friendship or love relationship. It's hardly a matter for distribution on the part of a centralized bureaucratic agency such as the state. I mean, you might recognize on the one hand that good work is beneficial psychologically and unemployment is psychologically harmful, but then nevertheless be skeptical about the possibility of the state helping to guarantee a right to work, just as you would be, I suppose, inclined to recognize that a teenager without a date to the prom is going to be damaged psychologically and feel bad about themselves, but it's not really the role of a centralized agency to be putting people together and helping to hook these people up. As I was just saying, one primary point of skepticism is that a good relationship, whether personal or professional, seems highly individual. And perhaps the proponents of the policy can, I don't know, get around this somehow by putting it in the hands of localized individuals who would help to arrange for this. But I still would be skeptical. As I said, it seems that the state is more suited to distributing an undifferentiated mass of good stuff like money than it is to putting people together for an ongoing relationship. And so I have those reasons for doubt. And also it might be mentioned that we appear to be moving into a future with a more diminished need for work, particularly as advancements in technology appear to lead us in the direction of perhaps even a 4-hour workday in years to come. We have good reason to accept a social norm of shorter working hours. I think it's quite possible to affirm on the one hand that work is an important part of individual and communal flourishing, and also on the other hand that work is not a good to be maximized, as though the more of it we have, the better off we are. The role of work in a good life is limited. It's one good among others. In order to thrive, we need good work, but we also need many other goods in life. And for this reason, I find it quite compatible to acknowledge on the one hand that work is an important element of a thriving life. It's the foundation of all prosperity, in fact, for individuals and for societies. But still, work has its place. It need not become overbearing in life, and it's not something to be maximized. So all in all, I think that there is a good foundation, a sort of normative foundation in the harmfulness of unemployment for this policy, but also a number of reasons to be skeptical as well. And I think that's about the few minutes that I have to speak then.
I can speak from here, or is it better?
Yeah, for the camera.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. I can also move it down if you'd rather sit.
Oh, no, that's it's okay. Right, so I think what I'll have to say would be broad agreement with what I just heard, but I'll limit myself to 3 points I want to make. The first one is what I think will turn out to be a consensus among us, namely that paid work is important for other reasons than just the income it brings now. And there are a number of reasons, which several of them you mentioned. If first reason is simply that the experience you get, the training you get in the current work is also something that will give you access later on to income and to other forms of work that you may want to have because of their quality or because the income they give, including possibly the income that you will be able to get because of this work after you retire. Number one. Two, it is, as you said, it's work is paid work is an opportunity, not the only one, but an opportunity to exercise and to develop your skills, your talents, and it's part of your flourishing. 3, it's an important aspect of social integration with your workmates, but also beyond that, through the network with which it connects you. And 4thly, it's also important for the sake of social recognition. Of course, social recognition should not be exclusively through paid work, let alone related to how much you are being paid for that work, but it is an important part of it. If some employer, public or private, is willing to pay for your services, it is a form of recognition important for many people, especially for those who get little recognition in different ways. So point number 1, paid work is important for reasons that don't reduce to the payment of that work. Second point that I think may lead to some controversy is what is the willing in the definition that was given earlier. As an analytical philosopher, I greatly appreciate explicit definitions. And so the beginning of the definition was a state-sponsored program to provide employment to all willing recipients. Okay, what is willing? Go back to the very beginning of our social assistance system. Juan Luis Vives, 1825, friend of Thomas More, writes De Subventione Pauperum, the first treaty in favor of some form of public assistance. Okay. What did he say? Every poor person is entitled to an income, but providing work. If even for the blind, you can find something to do. Okay. Is that willing? Well, you couldn't say it's willing because it's coupled with the prohibition of begging. Okay. So it's not quite the same as being in prison or being on the island of Utopia where everyone is forced to work. No, you are not forced to go to the workhouse. So Vives inspired, and later on the English poor laws, and no doubt the Scottish poor laws as well. And but the idea was, well, you can't beg. Of course, you can get help from your family without begging. So it's not like being put into prison and having to work in prison. It's not a concentration camp, but nonetheless, there is some sort of pressure, unfreedom in that sort of system. But you could say, well, it's only for the willing. Of course, you are not forced to come if you don't want to come, but you can't beg either. So that's so you can see there is more willingness here than in the case of a concentration camp or a prison or the island of Utopia. What about then if you say, okay, you can beg, then you get to workfare, including what you mentioned, namely the Indian scheme. Why? Indian scheme is workfare, because if you are able-bodied and you are of working age, if you don't accept this work to be part of that work scheme, rural work scheme, you get nothing. There is no benefit for the people who don't take that work. So that's a form of workfare, if you would say, because there's no alternative. But it's only for the willing. If you prefer to go and beg, if you have enough from your family, you can. So you can say it's for the willing. And so then you can say, well, yes, but that's not what we have in mind. We have in mind a system in which if you don't accept the job that provided by the guaranteed job scheme, you still get something. Okay, but how much? And so if you get, it's either the minimum wage if you accept the job, or a pathetic low income. I mean, you are entitled to something unconditionally, but it's very low, insufficient to live on. Well, you are not obliged to take it, and you have something as an alternative. So my second point is, what does it mean that to provide employment to all willing recipients? So it really depends on what the fallback is. So can you, or is it, or don't you have the right to beg if you don't accept the job? Do you get some sort of income from the state if you don't accept the job? and how much is that income. Note that there is a deep incompatibility between a guaranteed job and any involuntary unemployment benefit scheme, because as soon as you have guaranteed employment, there is no involuntary unemployment. Anyone who wants a job can get the job. It's part of the right you have. So any involuntary unemployment scheme becomes problematic. You can still have a guarantee, an income guarantee. You can have social assistance, unconditional, but you can't restrict, you can't have a scheme specifically for the people who are unable to find a job, because the job is there for you to get if the scheme works. That's my second point. And the third and final point is, which you touched on already, is the question of the economic cost. We must be extremely cautious about these assessments of the economic cost of schemes like this. Both those who say, among those who say, oh, it will cost too much, and those who say it won't cost very much. Because there is an obvious, so there is an obvious explicit cost, how much you pay to these people and how much you pay to the people who have to administer this scheme. Okay, but you rightly say, and it's important to say, of course, this saves, statically speaking, quite a bit of money, because otherwise these people would be entitled to unemployment benefit, or they would be entitled to some sort of social assistance. All this money you save. Moreover, as you also rightly pointed out, there are a number of dynamic damages created by involuntary unemployment in terms of health, in terms of criminality. Of course, all this is speculative to some extent, but there is no doubt a cost of this sort. And all this could be deducted from the real cost, the apparent cost of such a scheme. But on the other side, you must also be aware that it's also important not to be naive and not to think that it's obvious that giving a certain amount of money in exchange for some work on the part of the people will be cheaper than just giving that money. Why? Because you could say, well, there's all they do, these people, which is beneficial. I mean, in the text it says prudently finding suitable, fulfilling, and ideally useful tasks. But because if these jobs are not created, as it were, spontaneously, either by the private market or by public authorities, federal, national, or local, means that these jobs are not that productive in some sense of productive, even taking public good aspects into account, for which the state and the government needs to provide subsidies, not motivated by the concern for giving people a job, but by the concern to create some public goods. So that's the first thing, and it's clear that the places and the sectors in which there is an excess supply of labor, people who would like to get a job, does not correspond, is not automatically identical with the places, geographical, and the sectors in which there is a need for these jobs. And you can't say, well, sorry, but to have a useful job, you'll have to work, you can't stay in St. Andrews, but you'll have to either move or commute to Glasgow every day, because that's where the needs are. So that's one point, and let's be cautious about saying, well, part of the scheme will repay itself because the people will be working. Secondly, much depend on the degree of willingness, because the more people feel forced into that job, and because of the difference between what they get in that job, including in terms of future prospects, and the fallback position, the less voluntarily they are doing this job. And the less willing the activity is, the more costly it is to train the people, to motivate the people, to discipline them sometimes, to supervise them, to correct the mistakes they make. And all this is then a significant cost over and above the immediate cost of just paying these people. And third and last aspect that needs to be borne in mind in order not to be economically naive about the cost is the opportunity cost. Because, so for example, one of the schemes that has been proposed in Belgium by the very bright, articulate chair of our Socialist Party is guaranteed jobs. And these jobs must be CDEs, which means jobs, permanent jobs. So they are not just temporary jobs for 6 months or 1 month or 1 year or so. They are permanent. Okay, but for and minimum wage, like in the proposal. But for some people, this is a good deal. A permanent job rather than having precarious jobs in the private sector, etc. And so there is, as a result of that, you have, especially as time goes on, more and more people who take these jobs, who could take the job in the unsubsidized system, so either private or public, but who are happy with the jobs and with the job security of these things. And there you have a very significant unperceived cost of the scheme in the form of opportunity cost. What would these people do if they were not part of these schemes? They would be doing more useful jobs, in some sense of useful, because we have to be very more productive. And this is an important dimension to take into account. So these were my 3 points. So one, yes, we must fight against involuntary unemployment. It's a catastrophe. It's a disaster for many people. Paid work is very important beyond the payment of that work now. Two, it is very important to be careful about what we mean by willingly taking these jobs. And thirdly, let's not be naive about the cost of the scheme. Both, we shouldn't underestimate the benefit of the scheme and what it saves because of the effects. And also, we shouldn't underestimate its real cost because of these additional, more subtle dimensions. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, so we'll have Virginia there. Now we'll come in to introduce. Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm enjoying the discussion, the panel, my co-panelists, their contributions enormously. So I'm a lawyer, I'm a law academic, and so I was asked to contribute some thoughts on this, and I have 2 main points I'll make. On the one hand, I'll talk about what it is when we say that there is a human right to work, which is a right that we find in international human rights law and European human rights law and in other legal orders. And in the second part, I'll talk of my short contribution, I'll talk about welfare conditionality and the scheme that we have here in the UK, which is appalling. So my reaction to the job guarantee for Scotland is a positive one, depending on the details, obviously, unless the details are really not in line with these general ideas. So generally, yes, my co-panelists have said that work is an important good. It's important not just because of the income, but because it's fulfilling. It leads to self-realization, self-esteem. We create communities at work. We make friends, and for reasons such as this, it's a very important social good. In human rights law, there is a right to work. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has an Article 23 that says that everyone has the right to work, free choice of employment, just and favorable conditions of work, and protection against unemployment. And generally speaking, by various international bodies, the International Labour Organization and other bodies, the right to work is defined as a right to decent work. So it's not just a right to any job, it's a right to decent work. That's how the ILO, International Labour Organization, defines it, and the European Committee of Social Rights. In Europe, in the context of the Council of Europe, the UK is still part of it, we have the European Social Charter, and the European Social Charter has Article 1, the first article of the Charter says, in order to protect the right to work, it's a right to work. Article 1 of the European Social Charter, states have to accept that one of their primary aims and responsibilities is the achievement and maintenance of as high and stable a level of employment as possible, with a view to attaining full employment. This is what Article 1 of the European Social Charter says. And to protect the right to get a job freely chosen. So decent work, but also freely chosen work, and states have a duty to promote full employment, employability and full employment. The Charter also protects just working conditions, health and safety at work, fair remuneration, etc. The European Committee of Social Rights that monitors compliance with that charter, the European Social Charter, has defined the right to work, has said that the right to work is of fundamental importance. And it is important because it is a precondition for a lot of other labor rights that we find in the European Social Charter that makes labor rights very central to it. So there is a human right to work in international and European law. This is generally defined as a right to decent work, and it is of fundamental importance. My second point is where it has to do with welfare conditionality in the UK. In the UK, we have an extremely harsh welfare conditionality scheme. Unemployment benefits are conditional upon making a huge effort and applying for hundreds of jobs, with extremely harsh sanctions. We have one of the strictest welfare conditionality schemes in the world. Sanctions are, people have to apply for jobs, they have to go to interviews. If they don't turn up because they had a clashing funeral to attend, for instance, they may lose their social welfare benefits. The sanctions are extremely strict. People may lose their benefits if they don't meet the conditions of these schemes. They may lose their benefits, their welfare benefits, for 3 years. So on the one hand, here we do think in the UK, we do think that work is very important. We want everyone to work. And in order to achieve that, we have extremely harsh sanctions that push some people to destitution. This is how we deal with the right to work. At the same time, in the UK, we have a very flexible labor market. Precarious jobs are supposed to be fine jobs, good jobs, 0-hour contracts jobs where there is zero security, zero security for workers. They're fine. And in the UK, we encourage people, we force people to accept this kind of jobs through these very strict welfare conditionality schemes. So there are a lot of people who are poor and they apply for welfare benefits. And we tell them, no, you cannot take welfare benefits. You have to apply for jobs, to apply for numerous jobs, even not suitable jobs. There are jobs, often there are jobs that people don't want to do. They say, I want to do any job, but not one of these jobs when I won't know if I can afford my rent, not a 0-hour contracts job, but they have to do it. Otherwise, they'll be destitute. The European Committee, in European human rights law, again, the European Social Security Code, defines suitable jobs. When it defines what is a suitable job, like the job guarantee kind of job, these include the age, qualifications, experience, duration of employment, and the pay of someone. But in jobs that we encourage, force people to take in the UK, even the distance that the people may have to travel is not always suitable. The income is not always suitable. So we sometimes force people from, we get people who are unemployed poor to working and exploited poor, from out of work poverty to in work poverty and people who are exploited. So against this background, there is a human right to work in international human rights law, European human rights law. In the UK, on the other hand, we have we do value work, apparently, because we want everyone to, well, as many people as possible to work. But the scheme that we have may be incompatible with the human right to work. And this is because we impose on people extremely harsh sanctions if they miss the conditions that are set by the state authorities. And we also force through these people into work that may be exploitable. In 2019, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Philippe, came to the UK, and he produced a report that was shocking about what his assessment of the UK Universal Credit Scheme. So against this background, the Job Guarantee Programme, to me, as described in these proposals, which are vague, they're not very detailed, would be a good development, because people would participate in identifying the work that they will do. They do not experience the humiliation that people under universal credit schemes experience here. They're not forced into exploitative jobs that shouldn't be permitted, but they exist. They are not forced into these jobs with very harsh sanctions. And from the limited evidence I read of one of these schemes in Austria, my sense, I saw that people then find a job later on in the market economy. So it seemed to me that we don't ruin and humiliate people through a scheme like that could be tried, a small pilot, and it might encourage them also to get into the paid labor market after that. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Sorry, I've got a bit of a sore throat, cough, cold at the moment. Thank you very much for the invite. And it's actually, for me, as being a supporter of a job guarantee, it's fantastic to have a session specifically talking about this, because it's not a particularly well-known policy. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity to go into it in a little bit more detail. So a job guarantee for me is a priority if we're to tackle the multiple crises that we have at the moment. So if we think about inequality, the kind of current blight of poverty, and also the ecological damage that we're doing to the planet, the job guarantee is a potential way to solve those three crises. So that's where I'd like to start. Now, the job guarantee scheme embeds the government as the employer of last resort. Now, the government is already the banker of first and last resort, the doctor of first and last resort, the lawyer of first and last resort, the educator of first resort, the builder of first resort. And all of these functions, well, most of these functions were actually hard won, and people had to fight against some of the similar arguments we'll hear tonight, and actually we've already heard. Now, the government should be the employer of last resort. It should be the body that ensures your legal right, your human right to a safe and secure job. Now, I think to argue against the job guarantee is in a sense to kind of rail against public schools, roads, rail, maybe even the central bank. I think it's so fundamental that we have an employer, the government as an employer, last resort. Now, if this was a debate, then I would be wholeheartedly behind a motion that said the UK government should fund a job guarantee. But thankfully, it's a discussion, so we can kind of get into a lot more of the detail on that. Now, Tim, the outline that you've got is actually a really good summary of the academic literature on a job guarantee. Almost everything in there I would agree with. That's what the literature says a job guarantee is. We've already heard some things tonight which aren't included in what a job guarantee is. So I'm sure we'll get into the be able to discuss that in detail. But what you've got is a really good summary. There's one really important thing that I need to clarify though. The state paying for a job guarantee must be a currency issuing monetary sovereign state. So in the UK, that's the UK government, not a sub-regional or a subnational or a regional government like the Scottish government. So for sake of kind of like make sure it's clarity, we're talking about a job guarantee that's funded by the UK government, not the Scottish government. And hopefully we'll have time to kind of go into the details of why that has to be the case. So I was thinking, what is the chance of a job guarantee in Scotland? So firstly, it would have to be funded by the UK government. And I'm looking at the administration now and I'm thinking, is this a policy that the current administration would be interested in? Not a chance. Would a similar Conservative government be interested in this? Not a chance. There's no evidence that a Labour government would be interested in this either. So I think we've got to look at it as part of the United Kingdom and seeing this policy is really unlikely. Now, unfortunately, if Scotland became independent then the job guarantee scheme would have to be funded by a monetary sovereign currency issuing government. And that's not the current Scottish Government policy, which sees us tied to the English currency for a decade. So even under independence as currently planned by the Scottish Government, I don't think a job guarantee scheme would be possible. And again, hopefully I'll be able to explain the background to that. Now, I think we're in a kind of policy bind, owing to what economist Stephanie Kelton calls learned helplessness. And I think this helplessness demonstrates itself in the lack of policy options that we have available and that we discuss. And I think that's kind of powered by out of date kind of conventional wisdom. And I think there's a big part of economic ignorance as well. I think we've got much more policy options than we have under the kind of current neoclassical structure and understanding of the economy. So hopefully I want to get into the kind of macroeconomic stuff tonight, but pulling back to the job guarantee, there's two schools which are kind of predominant now in speaking about the job guarantee, and I'm going to represent both of them tonight. So the first one's MMT, which is modern monetary theory, and the second one is degrowth. So those are the two schools that are kind of talking about this policy more than anyone. Now, the most illuminating element of MMT is that it teaches us that monetary sovereign governments are not financially constrained and that they're resource constrained. And again, that's really important for this discussion because the Scottish Government is a currency user like me, you, this institution, and its relationship with money is very different from the relationship that Westminster has as the monopoly currency issuer. So it's really important that we understand that. That's why the funding has to come at the UK level. Now, I would say the UK government can afford a job guarantee scheme now, in the same way it can afford to completely eradicate poverty, in the same way it can afford to give everyone a safe, well-insulated home. And to quote John Maynard Keynes, what we can do, we can afford. And hopefully, again, we'll be able to come back and discuss that in a bit more detail. So the key insight from degrowth is that when you have an economy that's fundamentally on an economy that continually, perpetually grows, there's only two things that can happen: human extinction or planetary collapse. And I think the former is likely to arrive before the latter. And that's the logical process of degrowth. Now, if you accept that, that takes us way past speaking about individual policies like a job guarantee and much more about talking about what type of economy do we want. And again, I would love us to be able to kind of push the conversation a little bit towards that as well tonight. The job guarantee is a well-being policy. And I think it's going to have an incredibly difficult time fitting in to the current economic system that we've got at the moment. But I'm willing to take this leap, and I'm willing to say, if we did implement a job guarantee scheme, what would it do? So it really does two really important things for me. And the first is that it eradicates unemployment. That's its job. It's a macroeconomic policy to eradicate unemployment. And we've already heard some of the reasons why unemployment is such a blight. But there's a recent survey by Sydney University, and it found that 10% of suicides in Australia were down to underemployment or unemployment. And that is a huge cost to people, families, and society. Now, a job guarantee kind of removes that horror at a stroke. Now, the lack of a job impacts your mental and physical health, your happiness, your social integration, and all these things are longer when you're without a job. And even when you come back into the labour force, you're still affected by the time that you were unemployed. So that's the first thing it does. And now many sociologists see unemployment like a disease. And, you know, prevention has got to be much better than the cure. And I think if we are a compassionate society, then a job guarantee is a policy that we should be looking to adopt. Now, finally, and we've already had this mentioned, but finally the job guarantee affects employers and employees outside of the scheme. And it's a case of goodbye bullshit jobs. And bullshit job is actually a technical economic term for kind of precarious, low-paid jobs. And there's hundreds of thousands of Scots who are in bullshit jobs. And if we have a job guarantee, it removes all of those jobs. There's people who are on poverty wages, and they're lucky if they have a contract at all. And a job guarantee offers decent, fair, local, tailored jobs. Now, a job guarantee for me redresses the balance following 40 years of policies which have favoured profit rather than wages. So it's a fundamental rebalancing of our economy. And with a new player in the market that's providing these really good jobs, the private sector has got to significantly step up in the types of jobs it offers. Now, my final point is that the job guarantee tackles inequality, poverty, and ecological damage. But it's not designed for that. It's designed as a counter-cyclical macroeconomic stabiliser. So for me, that's all the benefits on top of what it does to stabilise a macro economy. But the challenge for me right now is to persuade the UK government that it can no longer avoid the things that we must do. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Marion Ellison, who is professor at Queen Margaret University, Edinburgh, and author of the 2020 book, Youth Vulnerability, Inequality, and Social Exclusion in Europe, Policy Lessons and Innovations for Improving Young People's Transitions into Work. So I'll hand it over to you, Marion.
Thank you. And in thinking about the job guarantee in Scotland specifically, I'd like to address 6 key areas. First of all, the underlying principles. Secondly, the context. Thirdly, the strategic issues. Fourthly, the governance. And fifthly, delivery. And finally, but really crucially, sustainability, I would argue. First of all, turning to the principles, the underlying principles of a job guarantee is a human right. Thinking about that in terms of, the legal basis of that, how far individuals in Scotland would have the right to address, issues around the quality of the work that's been allocated, for example. How would we think about the dimensions of the job guarantee as a human right? I mean, principally, the proposal is that, it's focusing on work that is, that is qualitatively adequate. It has a living wage in it, for example, or at least a minimum wage, thinking about it as a preventative policy, but thinking about it within the Scottish context. Since devolution, each administration has been broadly social democratic, and within that social democratic system, that thinking about that model, it's this close relationship between economy and society that is critical, this alignment. And the notion of an effective, sustainable job guarantee as a human right, I would argue, requires a really strong alignment between economic and social policy strategies, but also thinking about, for example, alignment between housing policy strategies, education policies, health policies, focusing within the context, adopting an ecological approach where you could argue that, we think about equalities as interrelated. So, for example, that the concept of health equalities are interrelated with labour market equalities, social equalities, educational equalities, and of course, taking that view, inequalities are also interrelated. As Goran Thurburn argued, when we look at inequalities, we can think about vital inequalities, existential inequalities, and resource inequalities. And in the same way, I would argue that the adoption of an ecological approach would be really critical in relation to the effectiveness of a job guarantee. So just thinking about the Scottish context, for example, and like societies globally, European societies and societies globally, think about the impact of the series of crises that societies have faced. The financial crisis, 2007, 2008, moving on to COVID-19 pandemic, and moving on to the current cost of living crisis. The profound impact on economies and societies in Europe and globally has been really significant. And in order to have any kind of meaningful strategy in relation to a job guarantee, I would argue it's really critical to take an ecological approach to future policy strategy. Just exemplifying this, for example, the austerity measures that were enacted following the financial crisis in the UK have led to the loss of 50,000 public sector jobs in Scotland, and it's envisaged that a further 60,000 jobs will be lost in the next 5 years. And whilst unemployment rate is at 3.9% in Scotland in September 2023, the economic inactivity rate is 22.7%. And this is really has emerged as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic largely, where particularly people working in the care sector, informal carers, people working in the formal care sector have not returned to the labour market. And I would argue this is a crucial issue. So if you're looking at policy strategies in relation to the job guarantee, it would be really important to closely align that with policy strategies in relation to health and healthcare and how we address health inequalities. Thinking about, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and exacerbated inequalities, widely, but particularly in the UK, as Professor Michael Marmot found in his latest report. And that's one of my key points that I would like to make. Also, I think in Scotland, it would be important to take account of regional variations across Scotland in terms of levels of unemployment, underemployment, and how we develop an industrial strategies, housing strategies to look at that. In terms of thinking about the job guarantee, again, whilst we have a fairly low unemployment rate in Scotland at 3.9%, the rate for young people is 8.7%. And this really relates to critical vulnerabilities that young people face during the transition between education and employment, as an example. And these kinds of barriers need also to be addressed when we're looking at a job guarantee more generally. So just that's kind of a key point. I would argue that really underlines the importance of policy alignment, and thinking about economic, social, industrial policies, with regard to investment in renewables and so forth. But critically, the alignment between multi-sectorial policies, education, housing, and skills development critically. Because if the underlying philosophy is that a job guarantee it intrinsically means a decent job, intrinsically means a job through which that person who receives that opportunity will be able to feel recognised, respected, and as Goran Thorburn argues, as an existential, critically existentially valuable aspect of that job guarantee, that job. It's really important to ensure that there's an underlying training element, skills development element within that, I would argue, at all ages. So, aligning a skills development approach to that, I would argue, is critical. But just turning to governance, and of course, how do we actually govern the implementation, the operationalisation of a job guarantee in Scotland? Well, Scotland has quite a complex governance arrangement in relation to community planning partnerships. Each of the 32 local authorities has community planning partnerships that work at different levels, regional, local, and so forth. Also employment planning partnerships, so third sector, private sector organisations work together with the local authorities in terms of, of developing innovative approaches in relation to opportunities for employment. And of course, following the financial crisis and the subsequent austerity measures and welfare reforms, these partnerships became really important. And I also remember being part of a European project involving 12 European countries, and we were looking at innovations in different European countries. And in Scotland, we were able to identify 150 innovations, which were really aimed at enabling people to enter the labour market in a way that ensured sustainability, that there was decent work, there was an element of training. And these innovations, some of them were really significant. For example, there was an innovation called PACE, and that innovation was really about the right of people who were made redundant as a result of the financial crisis to be given an employment placement within a similar skills area. And that was actually legal, that was a right. And that was really interesting as a basis of the notion of what actually does a job guarantee mean. But just turning to delivery, I think that, Scotland already has the advantage of this complex governance framework, third sector organisations working with the public sector and the private sector. And for young people, for example, going into employment, particularly young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, one of these, some of these innovations actually involved close alignment with social service support, health support, as well as skills development Scotland support, while that person was in that job, in that particular job, and usually within small and medium enterprises, which of course makes up a large part of the Scottish economy, around 95%. So that kind of delivery, how do we think about the job guarantee in practical terms, but also how do we operationalise it? Sustainability, the resourcing aspect, of course, is the key issue. How would this be resourced? In my opinion, it would have to involve really close cooperation between different sectors, public sector, private sector, as well as the state sector, in the operationalisation, for it to be meaningful to people who actually take up these opportunities, for it to be meaningful to local areas and the local industrial sectors in those areas. And I think thinking about how we look at renewables, investing in renewables, AI technology, investing in education, partnerships at different levels of education, again, really, really significant and really important. So I think that overall, generally, I would just argue that it's important to take a really holistic approach and to really think about these, an ecological approach, looking at the interrelationship between economy and society, but also between health inequalities, labour market inequalities, housing inequalities, crucially. So I note in the proposal that the proposal was that the jobs would be in close proximity to where people, would actually live. So that would be, again, a challenge, but something that with long-term strategic planning, it is very possible. But what the critical issue, and I would certainly agree, is the resourcing. How would this be resourced, particularly in light of Brexit, moving out of the European Union? Scotland doesn't have access to ESF funding, ERDF funding, and that was one of the key sources of resourcing actually that was used for these innovations following the financial crisis. But overall, I think I may have overdone my time there a little bit. Those were the kind of key points that I thought would be useful today. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to all five of you for some wonderfully illuminating comments on the idea of a job guarantee and its relationship to the Scottish policy context. We have one question for each of you, and as you're listening to each other give answers, if any of you feel like you want to jump in and add something or tack on a follow-up question or anything like that, just raise your hand, and if time allows, we'll get to you. Although I think we're running a bit behind, so we'll probably want to move through this relatively quickly to leave plenty of time for audience questions. And speaking of audience questions, I wanted to have this on display. So when people start putting questions in VBox, we'll all be able to see them. Okay, so we'll go down the line. Professor Veltman, you wrote a book about meaningful work, and if we have a job guarantee, surely we won't want to create just any jobs. We want to create, if not meaningful jobs, at least jobs that are good for the well-being of the worker in some sense. What do you think that there are any important obstacles to the state being able to create, if not meaningful jobs, at least good jobs?
Well, in the last chapter of my book, I talked about the notion of a right to meaningful work and also the notion of a right to work more plainly. And I think there's a lot of skepticism to be said about the idea of a right to meaningful work. There's much more to be said in favor of a plain right to work. But the skepticism surrounding a right to meaningful work really pertains to the agent relativity of meaningful work. Some people would find great fulfillment in carpentry, less so others. What makes work satisfying to one person is highly individualistic. In the philosophical literature, I know of only one person who believes that the state should try to guarantee meaningful work, and that would be Ruth Yeoman. But everybody else seems to highly criticize that possibility. On the other hand, though, there probably is much more to be said in favor of the idea of a right to work that is not bound up with a right to meaningful work.
Thank you. Yeah, great. That's really helpful. I think Alex.
By the way, it's probably better if you move back there because then the owl will clash all of us. Yes, so thanks. I had a question prepared, but you sort of answered it in your presentation, so I thought maybe I would ask you to fill in a bit more on something you suggested. So I take very much the point that willing to work is a slippery term in philosophical context because what people are willing to do depends on what their alternatives are. But if we were to suppose that there were some way to, as you have suggested, many ways of doing, to make sure that people have a reasonable alternative to taking paid employment, do you think it would still be possible to guarantee the opportunity to work for those who wanted it? Or were your concerns about affordability and opportunity costs to challenge that?
First, by way of background, the answer I can give to this question, I really want to support what you just said. Also, what counts as a decent job and what counts as a bullshit job is so dependent, not only on what people like to do and at a particular stage in their lives, but also on the minute details of the job itself. And so you may, in terms of content, the job may not be particularly interesting, but you have fantastic relations with your colleagues. I was often struck by testimonies by women, a group of women who were working in a slaughterhouse. And so they think really we got this really dirty work with what was Tesco. They were enthusiastic about their job because the nature of the relation between them and the way in which their work was being appreciated. And so, who can decide what a job, whether a job is decent or a bullshit job or worth doing or not? Is it the capitalist? No. So you shouldn't give more power to the capitalist in order to decide which jobs will be available. Is it the bureaucrat? No. Because when we say, well, there will be decent jobs for everyone, but who is going to decide on which jobs will be made available to the people, whether it's at the central level or it will be some bureaucrats, not a beautiful, and even if it were not the bureaucrat, but the Democrat and the elected representatives, who will it be? The conservative government will decide what's a good job and what's a bad job. So give power to the people, so that they can decide what's a good job, and then they may accept to do a job for very low pay, if they self-employed job or in cooperative or a risky job, a job involving a lot of training and therefore being paid quite a bit under the minimum wage, providing they have enough by way of a fallback, and so that's obviously part of the argument for an unconditional basic income, to say, and even it's not, it's really about the combination of its universality. You keep it if you get a job. So that means it's a sort of job subsidy, but only for a job that makes sense to you. It's only for, it's very different from a wage subsidy in this respect, but it's also a sort of a earning subsidy. But it's the worker or potential worker who decides, and so you need at the same time the obligation freedness, you are not forced into the job, and universality, you keep it if you have the job. And so in that context, you have then schemes that say, well, we give you not a permanent job forever with a good wage because of all the opportunity costs that are associated with it. But for some people in particular situations, it may be just as you need social work, you may need some sort of temporary, I wouldn't say it's not a general job guarantee, but certainly schemes whose main purpose is not to produce some public good, except the public good of reducing involuntary unemployment in a particular area. And so you may have heard of these zero zone chômage zéro, so unemployment zero and unemployment scheme. I mean, these are not at all general job guarantee schemes. These are really targeted at long-term unemployed people in order to get them motivated into jobs, and but these are not permanent jobs. I'm trying to get them.
Yeah, thank you. Well, in a way, this links quite nicely with what I was going to ask Marion about, because you mentioned the policy innovations to help young people in particular in small to medium enterprises in Scotland, but I guess it's something that could be generalised. But my thought was, listening to this, I think that there's something important here, which is some criticisms of universal basic income is that it leaves the individual with the responsibility to decide what they want to do with their time, or how they want to contribute to it. So it's nice and interesting to hear you speak about policies that may not be job guarantees, but do to some extent shift the burden of trying to find how to make a meaningful contribution onto the community in general, rather than having it all be individual. And I wondered if you could talk about policy innovations that you.
Yes, I think that particularly in relation to the operationalisation of job creation as right, thinking about it at local level, and policy innovations in Scotland are very much about how it's got the governance and thinking about it democratically. So, for example, there's a tremendous emphasis on the third sector working with the public sector and the private sector. the social enterprises are seen as critical to this, and small and medium enterprises. And the policy innovations in terms of at a local level are very much an integrated approach. So it's about, for young people with particular vulnerabilities, for example, they maybe have certain disabilities and so forth, or a range of disabilities actually. There would be social services would also be supporting that young person in that placement, usually the small and medium enterprise. So the small and medium enterprises, private sector, the public sector would be involved in that. Sometimes it would be third sector organisation, but there's always this emphasis on an integrated approach, so that the young people with specific vulnerabilities and barriers that they're facing do have that wraparound support, and it's about sustainability of that position, for that young person. And one of the aspects of that actually in the evaluation, I remember reading that small and medium enterprises really valued young people coming into their businesses because they had more digital know-how. They seem, and these some small and medium enterprise owners felt that they couldn't keep up with the technology. So in a way, it's kind of, added value. I know this is kind of to the company itself, but also to the young person, and the young person feels recognised and respected. So it was that kind of approach, but on a local level, and local employment partnerships as well work in that way across all 32 local authorities. And whilst you could say, one of the criticisms is that we're just not addressing the numbers of young people that need, high numbers of young people that need support, particularly following the COVID-19 pandemic, issues around mental health and so forth. It's the model itself, I think, that warrants attention. We need to think about in terms of investing in the future, how we think about substantial investment. I think the model itself does have a future. I think it is a really useful model, and I think that how we evaluate it is important as well. But it's about the kind of element of localism and local democracy, so that you're not having these centre top-down interventions, whether it's from the Scottish Government or the UK Government.
The bureaucrat.
Yeah. So sorry, that's a long answer to that question, but yeah.
Okay. I have a question then for Professor Mantouvalou. You talked about international human rights law recognizing a right to work. If we unpack the notion of a right to work, I've learned actually specifically from having read your work that can mean many different things. It can mean some of what it means is quite weak, like a right against being discriminated against in the application process. Not that that's not important, but it's much weaker than a job guarantee. So do you think that specifically something as strong as a job guarantee has any basis in human rights law?
Definitely. There is the right to work. So monitoring bodies of these human rights documents don't say that the state has to be the employer of last resort or anything like that, but that it should promote employment opportunities. The specific example where this job guarantee was implemented that I read in one of the articles that you sent us, I think, it was an article in the New Yorker that described what happened in a village in Austria, in a town in Austria, where they applied, they tried this job guarantee. It sounded fully compliant to me, it meets fully what a right to work should mean in human rights law. These are decent people participate in identifying what kind of work this can be. They last for a period of time. They are paid at least the minimum wage, and then they move on later on. So, yeah, it would meet it fully. Well, I think the question always is whether it is freely chosen work. So if a job guarantee comes with very harsh sanctions, no unemployment benefits at all, then no, then this is problematic. But if it is not, if it is voluntary, which is a big question again, but if it is voluntary, it would meet what the International Human Rights Law describes as a right to work.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, so to Liam, I'd love to get into what you said about degrowth, but I see that there are some audience questions coming in on that already. So I thought instead I would ask you to talk through the macroeconomic argument that you were alluding to, but didn't outline.
Yeah, sure. So this idea is a kind of post-Keynesian idea, that the private sector will never be able to provide enough jobs to give everyone a proper job. And it's been taken on, as said in the literature, by two new schools, which have pushed this forward as if you want everyone to have a job, then this has got to be done by the state, because these are jobs that are not being provided by the private sector at the moment. So the state comes in, and it's counter-cyclical, which means that when there's a recession or a downturn in the economy, then the job guarantee scheme expands. When the economy is doing quite well, the job guarantee scheme shrinks. So this is a macroeconomic stabilizer. So it could be maybe 50,000 people who are on the job guarantee, and during a recession it could go to 200,000 people. And then when the economy starts improving, it could drop down to 50,000. So that's the key role for the job guarantee, is this economic stabilizer. And the current economic framework we've got at the moment, it works by having an amount of people unemployed. And there's the kind of neoclassical term full employment doesn't actually mean full employment. It doesn't mean a job for everyone. It includes an amount of people, which is the NAIRU. So there's an estimation that there's a percentage of the population who are a reserve army against inflation. So this is the type of economic framework we have at the moment, which deliberately keeps thousands of people unemployed. And to go into your point about the sanctions regime, so we have a government who are saying, get a job, but we have a central bank who are creating macroeconomic policies to slow down an economy, and they do that by making more people unemployed. So just imagine yourself in the position of someone who's unemployed. You're wanting a job, but the central bank is creating an economy to not give you a job. Now that's the situation we're in at the moment, and that's where a job guarantee is fundamentally different. And that's why I said it's very difficult to fit the job guarantee into the kind of current economic framework, because it relies on having people unemployed. And that's why I said it's a well-being policy. Right now, we have a macroeconomic framework which only works by keeping a certain amount of people deliberately unemployed.
Well, I don't understand the macroeconomic argument specifically for a job guarantee, because obviously, as you know, unemployment benefits are massive macroeconomic stabilizers, and so any redistribution by the state, just in a recession, it increases, and that helps stabilize the economy. And so whatever you said, and some of it controversial, some not, about MMT, so the modern monetary theory, or the old debate between monetarists and Keynesians, etc., all this applies to whatever position you take there, but it seems to me that it applies to any redistributive scheme by the state, by the government, whether it takes the form of a job guarantee, which involves the redistribution, or the form of an employment benefit, basic income, whatever there is stabilizing. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, there's certainly an element of automatic stabilization with benefits for sure. I mean, a universal basic income is paid to everyone over whether there's a recession or not. So that's not a counter-cyclical support. Whereas a job guarantee scheme is as soon as there's the recession and you lose your job, you are given a job. And counter-cyclical, as you know, means that it shrinks and it expands during the economy.
Yes,
certainly,
so that's an employment benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Unemployment benefit is a similar policy, but it's not giving people a job.
No, okay, yeah. But in terms of the other question I have in what you said, is then this appeal, and I had forgotten that even in Article 1 of the Charter, which to full employment, But what does full employment mean? So you just alluded to that, but I want to make a different distinction. So in Dutch, we have a distinction. There are two translations for full employment. One is means that everyone is employed, and the other one is everyone has a possibility of being employed. And this is, I think, the first notion as an ideal, and that is making everyone working on being paid, doing paid work for one's whole life, for the whole life when one is not unable to work, is a totally absurd objective. And especially with the massive expansion of the labor supply, thanks to the women's participation in the labor market, we have a massive increase in productivity, and say we would like everyone, so men and women, to adopt the traditional male model in order to work for their whole lives, except when they are sick, on a paid job. This is absurd as an ideal, and it's absurd in terms of psychological sustainability or ecological sustainability and economic sustainability. And so, but the other objective saying everyone who wants to work and should be able to get a job. And so that makes sense. But it is crucially dependent, and again, on the fallback. That everyone who wants to work, but what's the alternative you give to people? The stronger the alternative you give to people, because it must be also reasonable in terms of.
Do you mean the financial alternative?
Yeah.
You give them a financial alternative, but it can be wider, and it is, but it must be non-work related. But if you give them a nice environment, public parks, good education, all things free of charge without having to pay, all these universal benefits you give to people, of course, increase their bargaining power and so they can be choosier, and that means there will be less people willing to work. It will be easier to satisfy full employment, understood as a possibility for everyone willing to work to find a job. And
well, the definition is everyone who wants a job can find a job.
Yeah.
That's the definition of full employment.
yes, but it's crucially dependent on the who wants a job. It depends on the fallback.
Absolutely.
And so the more
Yeah.
So in the or do you want to?
Maybe you can jump in, and then we'll go to questions from the audience.
If I'm right, and Alex, you may correct me. In this town where it was piloted in Austria, I think.
Yeah.
Marion. Yes, thank you. It was a little bit, the pay of the people got per month is just a bit higher than unemployment benefits. So that was the alternative. More or less the same money, more or less the same pay that they would get through benefits or through this job guarantee. And so this made a lot of sense to me. So the people who chose the jobs, they really chose them because they wanted to do something meaningful with their life and not just lie in the park for 4 months a month.
But the detail of it.
Sorry. We really should give the audience a chance to ask their questions. Alex, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I want to see if there's, this might be the most closely related to the topic we were just on. A question for Marion Ellison. In order to have a guarantee, is there a need for guaranteed skills training to not only define work, but also to maintain employment in a very quickly changing workplace?
Yes, I really agree with that in terms of and I just wanted to relate that to the point I wanted to make in terms of the kind of irrationality of the current economic system, neoliberalism and the reserve army of labour, when we think about the situation within the current UK economy, for example, where there are huge skills shortages across a number of areas actually, particularly in health and social care, but across a number of particularly higher technology professional areas. And that there's this lack of alignment between economy and society, of course, comes with the current economic system. And I would argue that, a job guarantee intrinsically involves an integrated approach to how we think about skills, particularly within education, further education, higher education, young people choosing the areas that they want to go into. I mean, that skills alignment is really critical, and in the youth guarantee, the innovations enacted by the Scottish Government following the crisis, every single placement had to have intervention from Skills Development Scotland and oversight to ensure that there was training going on. So yes, I would agree that the skills aspect is really critical. Another aspect of the shortages across sectors is, of course, the issue of pay, particularly within health and social care, and people not being able to sustain actually those positions without having a second job and so forth, nurses, for example, and care workers. But, that skills development aspect, I would argue, is really critical.
Yeah, so we have I'll ask next a question that came in from Sophie RD Blog, who's following this event online. I'm gonna give this to Andrea, although obviously once she's had her shot at it, you won't see it up there, by the way. The different set of participants up here and in where I'm looking. Give a first step to Professor Veltman, and then we'll see if anybody else wants to take a crack at it. So Sophie is skeptical about the connection between unemployment and suicide. So basically what she's saying is it sounds too simple to blame unemployment for high suicide rates. Can you do anything to sort of back up the existence of such a connection?
Well, there's a good deal of empirical literature on the harmfulness of suicide. There's a good deal of empirical literature on the harmfulness of unemployment, and the risk of suicide is one among many vulnerabilities for the unemployed. So essentially, anybody who is skeptical about the harms of unemployment should really read the empirical literature.
Okay, fair enough.
No, I'm challenging that. Okay. I also, does anyone want to raise their hand?
Thank you. Krzysztof from Krakow University of Economics. And thank you very much for your panelists for such a masterfully delivered argument. And most of those arguments were in favor. So in order to make the conversation a little bit more colorful, I will try to point out two risks I potentially see, and I'm interested about your assessment of those risks. So the generation of my parents and my grandparents lived in economy which crucial part was full employment. Yeah, it still worked well, and there was this popular saying, which you can translate to whether you sit or run, you get the 3K, which was a joyful way to say that full employment is works as a demotivation for workers. You do not, effort doesn't matter in full employment system. This is how it worked. And so do you see similar risks for this modern version of job guarantee? And the second thing, the second risk I wanted to ask you about is, so I work with people from business as a researcher and consultant, and many business people, small, medium, large, in Poland, what they say that the biggest problem right now is not having enough workforce on the market who take the jobs they have. We have very, very low unemployment, around 2.5%. And for many businesses, this is the main bottleneck, that they do not have available workforce where they operate and so on. So my question is it gonna be like long-term problem for productivity and for growing businesses, local, large, and etc. If all available workers will be on the job guarantee jobs and not on the available on the market.
Can you repeat the first risk? I didn't get it.
Okay, so the first risk basically is that if your job is guaranteed, the motivation to put effort into job is lower. So,
I think that's,
Sure.
yeah, I think that first question is really interesting because I think that issue of motivation links really closely with the meaningfulness of the job as well, and how far there'll be progression within that job or any kind of development or skills training that you could then go on to perhaps another company. And I suppose if the job was not meaningful or, you know, didn't have that training element of any kind or external education, like, you know, you could be doing something at university at the same time or further education or, and I think that would be really demotivating, and perhaps people would just see it as instrumental, you know, I've got this job for life, and how far would that impact on people psychologically in terms of their well-being is interesting. That's a really interesting point, yeah.
and also it has.
So I think maybe we need to kind of, although I should clarify one thing about when I outlined the proposal, I mean, a guaranteed job doesn't have to mean a job you can't possibly lose, right? I mean, if you show up drunk every day and get in a fight, you know, I mean, there surely are supposed to be some conditions.
I think it's a really important point to make, that we're kind of expanding it out of what the kind of academic literature says about a job guarantee. And a job guarantee is there for a counter-cyclical period of time. So if you lose your job, the government says to you, hey, here's a good job for you. You can stay in this job until you're able to go back into the private sector. That's the role of the job guarantee. And we expect people to come in who want to work, who do a meaningful job and have a meaningful impact, and then they go back to the private sector. It's a really important point to not confuse a job guarantee with any long-term job that you want the state to do. So if you have 10,000 job guarantee jobs and they're absolutely crucial and essential, then those jobs move out of the job guarantee scheme and move into the public sector. So if it's care that seems to be the best thing you're doing for a community, those are taken out of the job guarantee scheme and they become permanent jobs. So this is a route to permanent employment in the public sector and also a route back into employment in the private sector. It's not anything where you would sit in this job for the rest of your life. It's not designed for that.
Can I go into
We should, maybe eventually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Question here.
I would like to ask if, are you not afraid that the jobs that would be created under such a job guarantee scheme would be almost guaranteed to be bullshit jobs, in the sense that there would not be a genuine need for whatever is made in those jobs?
Well, I'm happy to take all of the questions, but please do. I mean, I'm certainly not concerned about that, because they are jobs that are designed by communities to add something meaningful. And you're almost implying that it's only the private sector that creates something that's meaningful.
No,
But that, in terms of that's what the question kind of implies. Because if these jobs are doing something meaningful, but they're not productive in the sense of not producing anything, those jobs have still got a lot of value. So most of the jobs that people talk about in the job guarantee scheme is in care or ecological development. So these are things that the market just not interested in. The market can't make a profit out of this, but there's a huge amount of social value in these types of jobs that a job guarantee would do. So I'm sorry if you didn't think you were implying that, but that's normally what people imply about. It depends on what you see as value. The private sector is only going to do something that it can make money from, but there's a huge amount of roles in society that need to be done by either the state full-time or the type of jobs that are in the job guarantee.
I would agree with that, and I think that the third sector has a large role to play in that. The care economy is critical.
That's where the delivery comes in the third sector. It's the third sector organisations that have these jobs. They're not government jobs. It's the third sector that implements it.
Yeah, and I think social enterprises, because I think the real value of that is in social enterprise. The inception of it, the creation of it, is addressing a specific need within that community. So social enterprise addresses that, specific need, whatever it is. It could be making furniture for people that can't afford furniture, or, working with homeless people, or whatever. And I think that inception, that using social enterprise as a model is really interesting because it can be really innovative and it's really valuable for that specific, the specificities of that locality. And then that could eventually be mainstreamed into public sector funding. So I think that the job guarantee scheme would have that extra dynamic, which makes it more valuable, as you say. I think that's really critical, yeah.
Great. So I'm gonna, there's a question that was submitted on Vlox. I'm gonna let Virginia take the first crack at this, or force her, as depending on how she feels it as an opportunity or an obligation. Depends on how you feel about it. How do you imagine a job guarantee interacting with the broader demands for better labor rights and conditions? It seems it would be positive in reducing the power that employers have due to the threat of unemployment, but do you envisage any risks in this respect?
We're talking about a hypothetical model. So again, to me, it sounded very positive. The big risks and violations of labor rights, we see them in a very unregulated market economy, such as, I don't know, in global supply chains, or nationally, we see them because we have a very flexible labor market that, as I said earlier, that encourages or forces people into any kind of job, such as 0-hour contracts or agency work. And this, in the private sector that is driven by interest in profit, this is where we see the biggest violations of labor rights. In a job guarantee scheme, from what I've read on how they are trying it, where they have tried it, I didn't at all have the sense that it may that there may be violations of labor rights there. It meets standards of a right to work, and I can't imagine it, given how people have participated in creating this work and envisaging how it will be. I can't imagine it being, and it pays at least a minimum wage, as we said. I can't imagine it being exploitative.
Thanks. We have a hand up.
Hand up over here, there's also a question there, so let's do the hand first.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question for open also for you. So the question is, how do you think about the stigmatization in this proposal of job guarantee? Because sometimes universal basic income is sort of superior in that way. And a practical question: at what level do you think that should be the wage of this job guarantee? Minimum wage, poverty line.
Sorry, could I just clarify, what was the first question?
The first question is about stigmatization.
Stigmatization from the job guarantee.
No.
There's William, who's sort of helping run the online broadcast of this, suggested the questions should be repeated for the benefit of the people following online. So let's take them one by one. There's a question about whether jobs in the guarantee sector would be stigmatized.
Yeah.
We'll start with that, and then we'll go to your second question. So open to any panelists who have a view on that.
I mean, there is unemployment carries a stigma with it. People want to work. Being on welfare benefits can be stigmatizing. People are embarrassed to apply for welfare benefits generally, unlike what the politicians say. I don't think it would be absolutely no more stigmatizing than being unemployed and on welfare benefits, or being forced to work into really bad jobs. And so I don't think it would be stigmatizing. It would feel quite dignified. You don't have a job, but you're willing to do some decent work for a while until you move back into paid work in the labor market outside this.
But the problem is that you can, in some schemes, maybe you can identify who is the one that is inside this scheme, like, this is the person that is working for, or because we have the job guarantee, we are paying their salary, and we have the same or a similar problem with the cash transfers or other, that's what they mean.
Yeah. No, I understand what you mean.
It's again where the fine grain of the proposal is so important, because there are, and in Belgium we had a number of experiments, never a general job guarantee, but we had schemes that were really meant only to provide jobs to people. And then depending, there was something that carried then the name of the minister who introduced, they were called Spitals, and the people under the schemes were called the Spitalists. And they were identified as being people who got the job, not because of the usefulness of the job to society, but because of the usefulness of the job to them. And so therefore this recognition aspect that was given to the job was eroded to some extent. And instead of the recognition, you had some degree of stigmatization. And so another recent experiment, of which there is serious literature, apart from the Marion case, is an experiment in Stockholm, where you had several schemes running in parallel, and one of them, and only one of them, was then for special activities in which only people under the scheme were working, as opposed to other activities where they were just embedded in existing administrations or existing services. And there again, there was a significant difference between the two cases. And maybe in part because of the stigmatization, but you really also in terms of the prospects for further jobs, even though they got the same pay, etc. And I wanted to add something because it's important in the interpretation of the Austrian case. And so I looked at the technical paper that analyzed it, published this year. And in fact, you also have to think about, all the people offered the job accepted it. And you could say, well, there was an alternative, which was an employment benefit. But you have to take into account the fact that an employment benefit don't last forever. And so if you take that job, then you renew the rights to an employment benefit. You can pay social security contributions that will enable you then to be entitled for a longer time to an employment benefit. So that it's always a question: what is the real fallback position, taking everything into account, that defines the voluntariness of the thing? And of course, the bigger the gap between the advantages you get from the scheme and what you would fall down on, the less voluntary it is. And so it's still in some sense voluntary.
So no job is voluntary anyway. So just, it's never voluntary to
No,
work.
that's my point. It's always a question of degree. But if you take the poor laws and you say, okay, you can take it or not, but you can't even go and beg if you don't take it. And so that's the extreme case.
Should we move on to the part two of this gentleman's question?
Sorry.
No, that's fine. So just for the benefit of the YouTube audience.
About the wage.
Yeah, so I think there's just a request for clarification. What would the level of payment be for?
Because it should be low enough to not disturb the labor market.
Right.
So you have always the problem.
Is it important to have it low enough?
It's got to be high enough to disturb the labour market. That's the point of it, is to make sure that the private sector start paying better wages. That's one of the key.
If you have like a very high salary, you will destroy it.
Well, it's got to be. I would say at the moment we've got hundreds of thousands of people who are working on a poverty wage. So there's a lot of margin here. So it's the literature is quite clear. It's a decent living wage. Okay, it's not a minimum wage job. It's a decent living wage. And if you look at this in America, where most of the work is done, this comes along with, the crazy things for Americans like healthcare, right? And unemployment benefits should you leave, and all these kind of weird and wacky things that only seem to as Europeans do. So it's a big part of that outside just the paid amount. There's so much more that's given on a job guarantee, especially in in America where they don't have these rights.
I would agree with that. The living wage is so critical, particularly if you take an ecological approach and looking at cost of living in the UK is really high at the moment. The cost of rents and so forth, and actually being able to maintain one's health and well-being to be able to sustain the job, you know, and there's travel costs and so forth. And I think the living wage is really critical to that. And I was just thinking about stigma as well, and I'm, you know, thinking about felt stigma where individuals feel stigma because they're going into a particular position, or enacted stigma. To me, it seems that the job guarantee scheme is really distinctive in that, unlike programs like the work program, for example, in the UK, whereby people were forced into the work program or they would lose their benefits, or the sanctions of universal credit, you know, that there isn't that enacted stigma from institutions. People are really, you know, that they're working in a meaningful role in the community, doing on the care economy, and they're getting the living wage. And you know, I couldn't see that, in my opinion, if those two elements were combined, they wouldn't be feeling that they don't feel enacted stigma, clearly. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So there is a question here that's directed at William, but maybe actually I could start by directing it towards Philippe, because I think you were starting to say some interesting things about this. So is there a degrowth argument against the job guarantee, that what we need is less work, less economic activity rather than more? And then there's a question of, if not, how would you envisage a job guarantee furthering a more sustainable society? But I wonder if, because you just brought up this question of, you know, whether it's a sustainable model to have everybody.
Yeah, but first a general remark about degrowth. I mean, we want degrowth. We want degrowth of consumption in our rich societies, but we can't reasonably want degrowth on a world scale. If we want to have a better alternative for these rural workers in India, rather than a miserable wage if they go on this scheme, surely India must grow quite a bit, and the growth of India is more than compensate any degrowth we may manage to do in UK or in Europe or in the US. So that we must be careful about what we mean by degrowth, the scale at which we envisage it, and even we may realize that we need to grow our production without having a high level of consumption in the rich countries, because part of what we produce will need to be consumed in poorer countries, thanks to transfers which we need to do towards those countries if we want the world to be both fair and sustainable. But then in connection with the transition, so it depends there on how we are going to measure this growth, because if you employ people at low productive jobs, it's not clear that the impact on growth will be significant. It may even be negative because of the opportunity costs and some people not getting employment in more growth prone private sector than is currently the case. But I think a more crucial question for the connection with the green transition, and we must have thought about that, is for the green transition, do we really, is the priority really need to give a job to everyone and to say, go and clean this park, this is crucial for the environment, and so isn't the crucial thing, as you alluded to, skills. We need to create more skills, and rather than getting these people, getting them employed, giving them a full-time job, let's promote lifelong learning and in all sorts of ways, and possibly by having some people who currently work taking some time off in order to acquire their skills, so that other people can take their jobs while they do that. But even for the people who are currently unemployed, I mean, it's the skills, or some old skills, care skills we'll always need, but also the sort of new skills one needs in the digital economy and ecologically threatened society. And so that having this obsession about getting everyone fully employed by providing either full employment through the private sector or by employing people, I think that's misguided if we want to focus on the green transition, which is absolutely essential.
Do I have a minute for this, or do you?
Sure, yeah.
Because there's obviously a lot of things here. the understanding of degrowth is very much that it's the global north that has to degrow to create
Sure.
space for the global
Yeah.
south. So that's really clear. No one who supports degrowth thinks that the global south should not have the same opportunity that the global north has had. In terms of the a job for everyone, there is nothing against a job for everyone being a 4-day week. So everyone's got a job, but they're only working 4 days a week. This is not about maximising the productive capacity of the nation. This is about providing decent and meaningful job for everyone who wants one, up to a certain extent that can't be provided within the private sector. So I think you made that point earlier as well. So that's a kind of clarification on that. A full-time job could be 20 hours, 3 days a week within the job guarantee. It's about realising the importance of work to individuals, but also realising that there's a lot of jobs, and I would argue with the green transition, even more jobs where we need people to do stuff, and the private sector is not going to be able to do that. So those jobs that you're talking about for the green transition, I think a lot of them would be job guarantee jobs. Now, I'm told there wouldn't be that many because the state would be stepping in and would be doing all of the work that we had to do, that we must do, to create a little bit of space for a job guarantee. So there's a lot more, obviously, we could get into that. I hope that's a kind of decent summary.
Yeah. Because we started 5 minutes late, maybe we would go until 5 past, or I don't know.
Do you have a question, or does somebody?
No, that was
No, I think we sort of conveniently, we may have exhausted all the questions that were out there in all of our many platforms.
Oh wow!
Being
Okay.
put, as far as I think I have the bird's eye view. I think that's kind of it. I think we can pat ourselves on the back and say we finished the job. No pun intended. So with that, maybe we should just thank with our applause our panelists. And thanks to all the members of the audience who came, whether you asked a question or not, especially those of you who did ask a question. Appreciate having you here. And to the online audience as well.
Thanks very much. And thank you to Ben.
And thank you to Alex.